Hey everybody, Dr. Mike here. Welcome back to our series of tutorial videos on the Korg Wavestate. Last time, we got into the basics of wave sequencing 2.0. We talked about how to set lengths on wave sequences, what each of the individual wave sequence lanes does, how to access controls, and how to use things like looping. Now it's time for us to go, as I said last time, into the weeds, where we start to look at the in-depth parameters of each one of these wave sequence lanes. Now I'd like to apologize for part 3 taking as long as it has, but it turns out that when you get this deep into wave sequencing, there are a whole lot of details that have to be covered carefully. And I'd like to thank everyone who commented on my videos, thanking me for the slow pace and depth that I've been using in order to make sure that this stuff is all clear. If that's the kind of approach that folks are interested in versus all of the fast and cleverly cut videos which try to pack this entire instrument into 15 minutes, then hey, I'm glad to do it, and I appreciate your patience as I pull these videos together. Part of the problem I ran into when creating this next set of videos is that getting into wave sequencing 2.0 turned out to be an even bigger job than I had feared. By the time I'd gotten through all of the various lanes and all of their various parameters and how they interacted with one another, I had created a video that was almost an hour long. And I don't think anyone, no matter how interested they are in the wave state, is going to be able to hold their attention for that long in one video. So what I elected to do was to find some logical stopping points and to break that hour-long video into 3 shorter parts. Part 3 of this series, the one you're watching now, will cover the master lane and the timing lane. Part 4, the one right after this, will cover the sample and pitch lanes. And then Part 5, to conclude this little trilogy, will cover the shape lane and what comes after. Don't worry, you're not going to have to wait 6 months for these. They've all been shot. All I'm going to do is edit them into smaller pieces and put beginnings and endings on them so that folks who jump into the middle won't feel lost. I'd also like to remind you that part 2 of this series covers the common features that every lane in wave sequencing has. Things like repeats, loop points, start and end points, and the probability function. You'll want to refer to part 2 of this series to remind yourself of the various controls that we're going to be using. On screen, we have the wave sequence lanes area, where we select our lanes and control things like note advance, loop mode, and so on. Off screen, we have the shift and enter keys, which are over here to the right of our display, and of course we select each step of a wave sequence using the set list and wave sequence steps keys at the bottom of the control panel. Once you've had a chance to refresh your memory on those things, it's time to dive deep. We're going to start our discussion by looking at the master lane, but because of the way the master lane works, it's going to be interwoven with our discussion of the timing lane. So we're sort of going to be doing these at the same time. This is the core of what is one of the most important and yet difficult to understand concepts within the architecture of the wave state, namely the whole concept of time and tempo. When the wave state talks about time, it's talking about clock time in seconds and milliseconds. When the wave station talks about tempo, it's talking about divisions of a bar, notes, dotted notes, triplets, and so on. The trick is, every single part of the architecture of a performance in the wave state can either look at tempo or time, and it can do so in a different way. Keeping track of all that can be really tricky, so we're going to take it really slow. First of all, remember that we can get into the basic performance setup parameters when we're on the home screen, which is accessed with the home button, and then clicking the left button once. This takes us into performance setup. Now, something to remember here is that if we access this page that way, it puts us at the bottom of the selection of parameters. So we hit the left button to go back up until we get to tempo. Now, this is the global system tempo for the wave state. It's the base tempo for the arpeggiator, and it's the base tempo for everything that happens with tempo sync inside the performance. So we'll see it later when we talk about LFO sync. We'll see it elsewhere in the modulation architecture. And most importantly now, this is our tempo that will control how the master and timing lanes affect what's going on inside a wave sequence. Okay? Okay. We're set to 120 right now, which is a good basic number. And we're going to now go over to the master lane, and we're going to see how that number interacts with master lane settings and timing lane settings to control the overall timing of a wave sequence. We hit the wave sequence select button, then we hit the master button, and here we are in the master lane. Right now, we have a selected preset, init master lane. There are a few other presets in here which sort of get you started quickly. And then underneath, we have a flag marked use master equals off. If we turn the master lane on, it says that the loop duration is 8 seconds, and it notes down here that the timing lane selects whether it works with time or tempo. That's a little bit annoying. It would be nice if we had a switch right there to turn it on or off, but it's something we can live with. You'll also notice over here that we have an LED indicating that the master lane is now on for this particular performance. If we go back to the main screen, you'll now see that instead of saying off, the master lane has a little progress bar, and it says that it's set to 8 seconds. Because our master tempo is 120, that means that this setting in time lines up very nicely with bars and beats. So when we play this sequence, we'll see that the master tempo lines up with step lengths fairly obviously. Now, to demonstrate what's going on here, I've created a new wave sequence tutorial patch. It's different than the one in part 2, only slightly, in that I've actually saved some loops for several of the lanes that are all of different lengths. For example, the timing lane has a 8-step loop, whereas the sample lane only has 6. The pitch lane has 7. It'll start from step 1 and then continue looping at step 2. And then the shape has 3 steps and the gate has 2 steps. As I play a note, what you're going to see is they all start in sync, and then because of the different loop lengths, they gradually get out of sync, so you get a random interaction of the various steps. Check it out. So as you can see, because I've chosen numbers like 3 and 7 against 4, 8, and 6, you have a situation where things don't repeat. What we're going to do now, though, is we're going to turn on the master lane. As I described earlier, it has an 8-second duration, which, with our system tempo of 120, means that it's going to line up nicely with the 8-step loop that we're working with. We have it set to 8 seconds. And now, as we showed before, we have the progress bar and the number. Watch what happens. So you can see that the wave sequence steps all resync to the beginning whenever the master lane reaches the end of its period. Now, as you might gather, we've chosen 8 seconds because it all lines up very nicely and neatly. What happens if we screw around with that? If we get into the wave sequence, master lane control, and we select the loop duration, and we set it to some random number, let's say 6.25, 6.25 seconds. Watch what happens when we play. The new time is reflected here. We hold down a note. That's good for creating randomness and uncertainty in a patch, but what you're going to be using a lot more often in a situation like this is tempo sync. So what we're going to do now is go to the timing lane, and now we're going to hold the Shift key and press the timing button again. And watch what happens. Now you can see the tempo light is on, which means that controls in the master and timing lanes are responding to tempo rather than clock time. So if we go back to the master lane, now instead of a time in seconds, what we have is a note value and a number of times it repeats. Note values can be as small as a 30-second note triplet all the way up to a whole note and beyond into this symbol, which, if you're not familiar with classical sheet music, you might not recognize. This is a brev, and it's equivalent to 2 whole notes. So we have here a whole note, a brev triplet, dotted whole note, a brev, and then so on up to 2 brevs. Now, that period can be multiplied by 1 through 32. In this case, what we can do is we can set, let's just say a whole note, go back to the main page. It now says whole times 1, and as you might suspect, now you'll notice that not only has the master lane changed its length, but the tempo of all of the steps has now changed to the point where it's running off of the system tempo rather than any of the carefully set timings that we had in the timing lane. So if we come over here and look at the timing lane, what we now see is that for each step, the duration has been set in terms of tempo rather than timing. And it's all defaulted to a basic number of an eighth note times 1. If we go back to the main timing lane page and we hold Shift timing again to turn off tempo, now when we look at our various steps, we can see that our time durations have been preserved, so they haven't been lost. Going back to turn tempo back on, we now see that we have these numbers, and we can quickly go through the steps and set them to the sorts of things we had before. So now when we play a note, you get the idea. Everything is now synchronized in such a way so that it resets frequently, and if we want to hear some of the evolution that we were hearing before, all we need to do is to set the master to a very large number, specifically a double brev times, say, 2, which is equivalent to 8 whole notes. 2 times a double whole note times 2. So you see it reset. And if we want to slow the whole thing down, we do that by changing the master tempo of the sequence from 120 down to, let's say, 100. What this means is, once we understand how the master lane and the timing lane interact with tempo, we have the ability to globally adjust all of these timing relationships simply by changing the system tempo value. Now that we've talked a bit about these interrelationships, I'm going to set the tempo to 60 beats per minute, which sounds like this. And I'm going to start looking at more of the parameters available inside the timing lane. As you may remember, we have a length of the lane itself, which in this case is 8 steps. We have the loop starting and ending at the same place, and the number of repeats that it has. But now we get into the specific timing properties. When we talk about the speed of the timing lane, we're talking about how quickly it moves with respect to the overall tempo of the rest of the wave sequence. This affects the timing lane as a whole. Each one of the steps is affected the same way. Now, when we turn tempo off, speed is given as a number. It's normally set to 1.0, which means that the speed matches everything else that's going on in the wave sequence. We can turn it down to 0.01, which means the timing lane happens 100th of the speed, very slow, or we can crank it all the way up to 100, which gets a little nuts. At that point, if you're working at normal tempi, you're in a situation where the timing lane is resetting at a point where it's almost at audio frequency. So, there's a lot of possibilities here. Now, when we turn tempo back on, watch what happens. Instead of 1.0, now it says normal. And if you change it now, it determines a proportion of the system tempo that it reacts to, from 1/4 of the tempo all the way up to 4 times the tempo. also now have the option of swing. You can have a duration in terms of note value, and then how much swing you want to add. And you can even have negative swing. Which is rushing notes rather than dragging notes, which is interesting for some effects, although it's not something you usually hear or see in other DAWs. Now we get to the crossfade control, which can be either time or tempo based. Crossfading is important because each step has its own setting to crossfade between the step that came before and the current step. Let's jump into one of these timing lane steps, and you can see that the crossfade, which is all the way down here, has the ability to determine how quickly there's a change. If we go back to the main timing lane controls and we change from tempo simply to time, then when we go into this step, we see that the number is in seconds. And it can go from 0 all the way up to, well, you get the idea. The other thing you'll notice here is that it is possible to set the duration of a timing lane step according to time or tempo, which you would simply do by setting shift timing, turning on the timing light, and then instead of a number of seconds, you now have a note value and a number of multiples. However, crossfade is still listed in seconds. That's because on the main timing lane page, we've elected to have it work in time. This is important because for a lot of crossfades, what you actually want to be able to do is to set this duration to be very small, a few milliseconds. Why would you do that? To smooth out transitions between successive steps. That's important because, as you may remember from listening to our tutorial patch in the last part, we had a 0 crossfade, so we heard a click every time the step reset. This helps you avoid clicks, and for more subtle morphing sounds, you can set this number to be higher. And if you choose some value that does not line up with the tempo, it can provide a more organic kind of a feel. Elsewhere in this timing lane page, you can see that the step has the ability to set a duration, as we've discussed, and it also has the ability to determine whether each step is a note, rest, or gate. Here's an example. This is step A1, and we've got it set to note. We play the note, and this is what we get. Right? Right. Set it to rest, though. Play the note. So you can now have rests where you get no sound involved in various parts of the sequence. And then there's gate. Now that doesn't seem all that useful, but if you actually use gate at a later step, let's go to, say, step 4. If we set this one to gate, what we have instead now is so it allows you to open a note that sustains with a wave sequence to create an unusual attack or opening. Finally, we have the fade in and fade out parameters. This controls the shape of the transition between steps. Linear is the default. We can go negative until it's logarithmic, which means it starts quickly and then slows down. Or we can go positive up to exponential, which means it starts slow and speeds up. You'll find that sometimes when you're using longer fades between steps, being able to tweak this curve will give you a more natural or musical sound. All right, that brings us to the end of this part of the video. We've talked about the master and timing lanes and their interaction with one another and with the rest of the architecture of the wave state. In our next video, we're going to talk about the sample lane and the pitch lane, which also have a surprising number of interrelationships that we need to discuss in detail. Until then, please remember to like my channel and subscribe, and to check out musicplayernetwork.com, an online forum for professional and soon-to-be professional musicians with all kinds of useful information on everything from keyboard playing to sound engineering and sound design. Part 4 is coming right up, and until then, please remember to stay safe, stay sane, and stay connected.